Welcome to the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production. For transcriptions, show notes, and extras, please visit us at theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. Now, broadcasting across the world from the heart of the American Bible Belt, here is your host, Michael B. Rush.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Black Swan Rising podcast. I'm your host, Michael B. Rush. In our last episode, we reviewed the first 12 chapters of Ezekiel and contrasted them with the first 12 chapters of the book of Revelation. And I pointed out many significant parallels that exist between the two. The book of Ezekiel, the first 12 chapters in particular, were focusing on prophecies pertaining to the destruction of Jerusalem. The first 12 chapters of the book of Revelation are prophetic warnings regarding the destruction of that will occur upon the earth universally during the great and terrible day of the Lord, meaning Ezekiel's prophecies of the destruction of Jerusalem were meant to be types and shadows of the pending destruction that will take place in the last days. You will recall that some of the things that Ezekiel highlighted were strange wheels that went upon their four sides that descended from the heavens, out of which living creatures covered in eyes with wings and faces represented by the four standards of the four camps of Israel came out, and ultimately 1/3 of Jerusalem was burned with fire, 1/3 of its inhabitants were put to death by the sword, and then 1/3 of the survivors were scattered amongst all the nations, where Ezekiel prophesied that they would be recovered from in the last days. Ezekiel also talked about a throne that he saw above these flying wheels, and he saw God sitting upon that throne and a rainbow indicative of the covenant that God had made, that not only would he scatter Israel in their sinful state, but that he would restore them in the last days. Some of the interesting things that were highlighted within the first chapters of Ezekiel were, and some of the supplemental material that we went over, such as the history that Flavius Josephus recorded, was the presence of false prophets leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. A curious side note is that Josephus stated that hardly any of the Christians were killed during the Roman siege, because when Christ taught the Christians, he told them that when they see the abomination of desolation coming, that they should flee from Jerusalem. And that is exactly what they did. So I think that when you look at the book of Revelation and the prophecies of the false prophets that will exist in the last days, and, it gets a lot scarier in the book of Revelation than just false prophets. We're talking godlike individuals that are coming, and beasts as well that do incredible things, that the Christians should be able to see these things if they have eyes to see and escape these pending destructions, just as the Christians from Ezekiel's prophecies were able to escape. Now, obviously, there are many, many more parallels to the destructions that happened to Jerusalem and the destructions foretold of in the book of Revelation, which was primarily the purpose of the prior episode. I'm not going to rehash all of those here, but it's important for me to highlight that I didn't go over all of the similarities and the takeaways that are there for those with eyes to see in these 12 chapters in both Ezekiel and the book of Revelation. So I hope that you have taken the time to personally dive in and seek the Lord's guidance as you study these things out for yourself. Don't think for a moment that I have told you everything there is to know about these things, because I most certainly have not. Well, let's dive into today's episode. So, in the last episode, I hinted and we briefly covered the fact that there are three nation states of Israel that have existed in antiquity. And I talked about the great importance to look at the events that will transpire in the last days from the perspective of these three separate nation states. And I briefly mentioned, and I'm going to elaborate on this much more in this current episode, that in the order in which these three nation states fell in antiquity, they would be restored in the inverse order in the last days. And this goes to the repeated prophecy from the Bible that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, meaning that any time that you see anything happen to these three nation states in antiquity, the same things or the inverse of those things will happen in an inverted order in the last days. So just to illustrate, the lost 10 tribes, they were the first nation state that was destroyed. They were destroyed in around 720 BC when the king of Assyria came in and wiped them out. So according to this principle of the first shall be last and the last shall be first, they will be the last nation state to be restored in the last days. And we'll get into what that restoration looks like in today's episode. But the last nation state of Israel to have been destroyed was also touched upon in the prophecies of Ezekiel, when Ezekiel was told to lie upon his side for 390 days. And in the prior episode, we talked about how that was 390 days from the administration of the Messiah. So Christ began to administer to the house of Israel in the flesh upon the earth around the year 30 AD. So what Ezekiel was saying was that 390 years from when Christ would begin his administration to Israel in the flesh, that the nation state of Joseph would be destroyed, and that 40 years from the commencement of that ministration, of Christ's personal ministration to the house of Israel, the nation state of Judah would be destroyed. So along those same lines, Joseph, as the last nation state having been destroyed in 30 plus 390 would be 420 AD, and that is corroborated by the Book of Mormon, which is another testament of Jesus Christ, and speaks about when that Christ did not only administer to the nation state of Judah, but that after his resurrection, he came to the nation state of Joseph and administered to them. And that record is included in the Book of Mormon that is referred to as Third Nephi, commencing in Third Nephi chapter 11. If you have never read that account, you are living beneath your privileges. It's incredible. Now, one of the things that Jesus Christ told the nation state of Joseph when he was administering to them was that he would also go and administer to the nation state of the lost tribes of Israel. And he said explicitly that they are not lost unto the Father, for the Father knoweth whither he hath taken them. Meaning that around 34 AD, there was a nation state of Joseph, and there was a nation state pertaining to the lost 10 tribes. Now, we know of no nation state affiliated with the lost 10 tribes existing upon the earth at 34 AD. And of course, when you look at the account of both Ezekiel and found in the book of Revelation that we reviewed in last week's episode, both those accounts indicated that there was a body of the house of Israel that would come to the earth from the ends of heaven. In Ezekiel's vision, he saw them descending in these wheels that went upon their four sides. And in John's vision, he saw these star-like objects that descended from the heavens to the earth, out of which came swarms, locust-like swarms of people that went on to destroy 1/3 of mankind. Also in Revelation chapter 12, John saw that there was a woman representing the house of Israel that was given the wings of a great eagle, with which she was enabled to flee from before the face of the dragon who was bound to the earth. Of course, that revelation began with that woman standing upon a former fragment of the earth, the moon, before the birth of Christ, which also corresponds with these other narratives of a body of the lost tribes of Israel being removed prior to the birth of Christ. So in today's episode, we're going to jump into a lot more of the scriptural evidence for these things. And I think that you will find there is a lot of scriptural evidence for this, and that it's fascinating. And indeed, if this doesn't blow your socks off, you're not paying attention. So the first passage that I would like to talk about comes from the Apocrypha. Now, the Apocrypha was included in every King James Bible up until the start of or right before the 20th century. That's when the Church of England decided they were no longer going to include the Apocrypha. But prior to that, it was included in every Bible. There were 14 books that were included between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And what we're going to read comes from Second Esdras, which was one of those books. In this passage, I'm going to read from Second Esdras chapter 13. I'm going to read verses 40 through 47. But to give you a little context for what's going on here, Esdras, which is just the Greek name for Ezra, and this is the same Ezra that's included in the Bible, Ezra had this vision in the which he sees a massive multitude, and he asks his angelic guide, who in the heck are these guys? And the angelic guide explains to Ezra who they are. And this is what he says. Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land. So came they into another land, but they took this counsel amongst themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt, that they might there keep their statutes which they had never kept in their own land. And they entered into the Euphrates by the narrow places of the river, for the Most High then shewed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely 1.5 years, and the same region is called Arsareth. Then dwelt they there until the latter time. And now, when they shall begin to come, the highest shall stay the springs of the stream again, that they may go through. That is, again, from 2 Esdras chapter 13, verses 40 through 47. So here, Ezra is instructed by this angel that there was a body of the 10 tribes that were preserved in Assyria. Now, let's just talk about the scope of this body, okay? If you think back to the Bible, there's a time when Elijah is mourning the fact that the northern kingdom of Israel is in a state of abject apostasy. In fact, he is weeping to the Lord and says, Lord, I alone remain faithful in the northern kingdom of Israel. And the Lord corrects him and says, Elijah, you've got that all wrong. There are still 5,000 men that have not bowed the knee to Baal. So by this, we are to likely understand that there weren't just 500 men, or 5,000 men, but likely 5,000 households that had not bowed the knee to Baal. So from the writings that we reviewed in Ezekiel and the book of Revelation, in the prior episode, we learned that the righteous were sealed in their foreheads and they were preserved by the Lord, both in Ezekiel's prophecy and in John the Revelator's prophecies. Therefore, we can presume that the righteous would have been preserved when the king of Assyria came and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. And so I would suggest that these 5,000 households, they were carried away captive into Assyria, and they comprised this group that said, listen, our fathers, they turned their back on the Lord. They worshipped an alternate version of God. Baal simply just means the Lord. So they were worshiping a version of the Lord that they had created themselves. And we don't want to continue in the same wicked tradition of our fathers. So let us, as a people, pray to the Lord that he will have mercy on us and lead us out of this land into another land. And the Lord answers their prayers. And in a very similar display of power to, if you recall, when Joshua and Caleb lead the 12 tribes of Israel into the lands of Canaan for the first time, he stopped the waters of the river Jordan, and the 12 tribes walked through on dry ground. When this body of the northern kingdom of Israel left Assyria, the Lord stayed the river Euphrates so that this body could walk over the river Euphrates on dry ground as well. And then the Lord says that they traveled for a year and a half to a region called Arsareth, where mankind had never dwelt before, and that they would return from Arsareth in the latter time, and that when they returned, the river Euphrates they would be able to walk through the river Euphrates again on dry ground. Now, the book of Revelation gives some very curious insights into how this happens. Let's check out what the book of Revelation says on this subject. Now, remember in the vision of both Ezekiel and John, Ezekiel sees these 6 serpents that carry weapons of destruction that go into Jerusalem, and John sees these 6 angels, and they pour out these vials that have plagues. Now, in addition to these 6 servants that Ezekiel saw, he saw a scribe who was, dressed, peculiarly, and John sees a 7th angel who is dressed very similarly to how Ezekiel's scribe was dressed. So again, you've got these additional similarities, but I want to read the passages from Revelation chapter 16 that talk about what happened when the 6th angel poured out his vial. So this starts in verse 12, and this is everything associated with the 6th angel's vial. And when the 6th angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of the great day of the God Almighty. Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walketh naked, and they see his shame. And he gathered them together into a place in the Hebrew tongue called Armageddon. Okay, let's unpack this because there's lots of very interesting and relevant information here. So this 6th angel pours out his vial upon the river Euphrates to dry it up, in preparation of the return of the kings of the east. Well, according to this passage in Second Esdras, the river Euphrates is going to run dry or be dry when the lost 10 tribes return. Now, presumably, when they return, if you look at some of the passages that we reviewed in the last episode, when 1/3 of all mankind is killed by this incredible, again, this is associated with the sixth angel's trump, as is recorded in the book or in chapter 9. Listen to this, just so that we understand that this sixth vial and what this sixth angel does in chapter 9 are related. Saying to the sixth angel, which had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels, think 4 camps of Israel that are represented by the face of a lion, face of an ox, face of an eagle, and face of a man, which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Now, this is indicative of they crossed over the river Euphrates in antiquity, and they are going to return through the Euphrates, but that time for their return is not going to happen until the river Euphrates is dried up. That's what it means that they are bound. They're bound by time. In the timing of the Lord, when the river Euphrates dries, then they will return. And it goes, and the 4 angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year for to slay the 3rd part of men. Now recall, this is very similar to the 3rd part of the Jews that were put to the sword in the siege of Jerusalem. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000. That means 200 million. And I heard the number of them. So, and then in verse 18 it says, by these were 1/3 part of men killed by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouths. Meaning that when the kings of the east return via the river Euphrates, that 1/3 of mankind will be eliminated at their coming. Now, going back to Revelation chapter 16, at the same time that this happens, that the kings of the east are returning, John saw the unclean spirits come out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. This is symbolic that the time of this unholy Trinity's greatest power corresponds with the return of the kings of the east, meaning the leaders of the nations that are coming to reclaim their ancestral homelands. This is what it's talking about. And that all of this is going to culminate in the lands that are called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. Now, Armageddon derives from the word Megiddo. And Megiddo refers to the location, curiously enough, where from prior episode, you will recall that we talked about Deborah's song of victory when the kings of heaven came to the earth and the stars fought on behalf of Israel against Sisera and the Canaanites' 900 iron chariots that existed before the Iron Age and was the reason that this particular contingent of the Canaanites was not subdued hitherto. Even when Joshua and Caleb were full of the power of the Lord and led, an army of 600,000 Israelites against the Canaanites and wiped out everybody else, they could not overcome this, Sisera's 900 iron chariots until there was this great battle when the kings of heaven came down and wiped out the 900 iron chariots. This corresponds with the description in the Thule papyrus that we talked about, where the Egyptians saw the skies, from Egypt all the way to Megiddo, filled with what they called were fire discs from the north to the south, to the four pillars of creation, to the east, to the west. In other words, this was a massive host that came from the heavens to defeat a contingent upon the earth that had been enabled through what I believe was extraterrestrial technology, remnants of the Watcher technology. And so I find it very curious that this battle that will take place in the last days takes place in the same location. Armageddon is Megiddo, in that same valley that the 900 chariots were wiped out in, ancient times. I think that this too is a type and a shadow, and this correlates with the return of a vast host from that in antiquity comprised the northern kingdom of Israel. So this is very interesting. And then John says, listen, this is all going to come as a thief in the night. And blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. What is John trying to communicate here? Well, this is very similar to how the Christians were able to flee from Jerusalem and from the destruction that came because they were watching the signs. And John is saying, listen, these events, the return of the kings from the east, this is going to catch the world completely off guard. They are not looking for this to happen, and it will catch you unless you are diligent and looking for these signs. You will be caught off guard, and you don't want to be found naked in the sun, meaning you don't want to be drinking the Antichrist Kool-Aid only to find out that you're naked, that the emperor has no clothes. You want to be every bit as prepared as the ancient Christians were, who were able to flee the abomination of desolation, the first abomination of desolation. And if you are watching, then you can escape the second abomination of desolation when Jerusalem is sieged by the Antichrist and the beast the second time around. So this is very interesting stuff. So let's look at another passage that talks about this. And I mentioned, in numerous episodes now that I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Joseph Smith has taught some very curious things about this. I mean, we've talked about some of the things that Joseph Smith mentioned about the beast being literally a creature that comes to the earth from another world that exists apart from the human family, and that these beasts will have a major role to play in the last days. Well, he also taught some very interesting things regarding the return of this mighty host of which we have been speaking. Now, these things are strange. And so, it's almost as if these things have been scrubbed from the official narratives of the church. But if you go back and you read in the journals of the members of the church from Joseph's day, you see that Joseph was clearly talking about some very strange things. And I'm going to read you some of these journals that talk about these things. This first account that I'm going to read comes from the journal of Samuel Hollister Rogers, and it's page 17 from his journal. Now, Joseph Smith he was constantly being harassed by mobs. And so one of his favorite hideouts when the mobs were out to get him, he would go to the Vincent Knight home and hang out there. And this account is a retelling of something that happened when Joseph Smith was hiding from the mobs in the Vincent Knight home. When the world was first made, it was a tremendous big thing. The Lord concluded it was too big. We read in the scriptures that in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. So the Lord divided the earth. When the 10 tribes of the children of Israel went into the north country, he divided it again. So the earth has been divided and subdivided. We also read in the scriptures that the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunken man. What shall cause this earth to reel to and fro like a drunken man? We read that the stars shall fall to the earth like a fig falling from a fig tree. When these stars return to the place where they were taken from, it will cause the earth to reel to and fro. Not that the planets will come squarely against one another. In such case, both planets would be broken to pieces. But in their rolling motion, they will come together where they were taken from, which will cause the earth to reel to and fro. This is Joseph Smith, winter of 1840, when he was in the Vincent Knight home in Samuel Hollister Rogers' journal. It comes again from page 17. Now let's look at an account written by Martha Cragen Cox. Coming in one day and seeing my geography on my map, meaning he had apparently a map of the world on his lap. Jacob Hamblin told me that the prophet said to him that at the North Pole is a convex or a cup-shaped depression with the deepest sea resting there. The planet that belongs to that part of the world would in time return to its place and strike the earth at that part, complete the sphere, and the result would be a reeling to and fro like a drunken man by the earth. Okay, so let's just talk about these two separate accounts. In both of these accounts, it appears that Joseph Smith was teaching that the northern, or this remnant of the northern kingdom of Israel, which apparently was massive if it was comprised of 5,000 households, when they went north, ultimately the Lord removed them. He took a chunk of the earth, according to Joseph Smith, and removed it completely. And that in the last days, that portion of the earth would return. And when it is restored, it will come right back on the northern polar ice cap, which will, cause the ice to flow down at its return and will, cause the earth to shake terribly. Now, I know that, that sounds completely bonkers. And, I know that, there are, people, members of, my own faith that, upon hearing these things will go, oh, something's wrong here. This cannot be. Joseph Smith never would have said something so crazy. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because Wilford Woodruff, who became the president of the church after Brigham Young, he wrote in his journal every single day. So he's got a very, very detailed journal. And he wrote a curious entry in his journal that reads, "The evening was spent in conversing upon the subject of the 10 tribes in the North Country. A portion of the North Country containing the 10 tribes may be separated from the earth. Orson Hyde and others believed that they would return soon." And then, subsequently, later on in his journal, many days later, he wrote this: "President Young said he heard Joseph Smith say that the 10 tribes of Israel were on a portion of land separated from this earth." Okay, so here you have President Brigham Young teaching Wilford Woodruff, which would become the president of the church, that Joseph Smith taught him personally that the 10 tribes had been removed from the earth on a portion that had been taken away. This is very consistent with the other people that are writing in their journals about what Joseph Smith taught them. Now, this is a very curious hymn that existed in the early hymnal of the church. I mean, it continued in the hymnal as late as 1905. It was hymn number 322. And this is the 5th verse of that hymn, which was written by Eliza R. Snow, who was very familiar with Joseph Smith. Listen to this verse. And when the Lord saw fit to hide the 10 lost tribes away, thou earth was severed to provide the orb on which they stay. Okay, so clearly this is not just some, passing reference. This was more widespread than, people today in my church want to acknowledge. Now, let me give you another example. This comes from a question and answer session that was written in the Church of Jesus Christ early newspaper that they would publish for all of the saints. And Joseph Fielding, who was the president of the British Isles mission at the time, wrote to that publication, which was the Millennial Star. And the editor of the Millennial Star, who was an apostle in the church, Parley P. Pratt, responded and answered the questions. So I'm going to read extracts of that publication. Dear Brother Pratt, having a desire to know the truth of all things that are revealed from God to man, and knowing in part the importance of the teaching of them to mankind, I take the liberty to ask you certain questions, which, if you think proper, you may answer in the Star, as I do not ask for my own information alone, but for all who desire and seek after truth. Well, friends, I hope that all of those that are listening to this podcast are seeking for truth. Well, here's question number 7 from this letter. How can the stars fall from heaven to the earth when they, as far as we know, are much larger than the earth? Okay, I know that this sounds like a crazy question. Keep in mind that this was written in the 1800s when we don't really know, or they did not know nearly as much about the cosmos as we know now. I mean, keep in mind that it wasn't until the 20th century that we came to understand that the Milky Way was a galaxy and not the entire universe. So when Joseph Fielding is asking this question, he's saying, listen, I think that the stars are a heck of a lot bigger than the earth, so how can they fall to the earth? That doesn't make sense. Can you please elucidate that? And here is Parley P. Pratt, the apostle's response, as published in the church's newspaper, the Millennial Star. We are nowhere given to understand that all the stars will fall, or even many of them, but only as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken with a mighty wind. The stars which fall to the earth are fragments which have been broken off from the earth from time to time. This sounds exactly like Elder Pratt is quoting Joseph Smith's teachings about the 10 tribes being removed from the north countries on a fragment of the earth that had been carried away, which is very consistent with Revelation chapter 12, when you see the woman representing Israel standing upon a former fragment of the earth in space prior to the birth of Jesus Christ. Okay. Now, returning to his response. These all must be restored again at the time of the restitution of all things. Now, he's referring to all of these former fragments of the earth must be returned to the earth. And again, according to the principle of the first shall be last and the last shall be first, the last fragment that was taken will be the first fragment to be restored, and the first fragment to have been taken will be the last fragment to be restored. And then he goes on and says, this will restore the 10 tribes to Israel and also bring again Enoch's city. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believes that when the Bible talks about Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him, that God literally took Enoch and all of the righteous people that were following him and removed them from the earth prior to the great flood, and so that they would not be destroyed, and then wiped out the civilization that had been corrupted by the Watchers, and that portion of the earth will be restored again, but that portion will be restored after the 10 tribes are restored on their portion of the planet that was removed. So that is very interesting. Now let's look at another person's journal. This is coming from the Journal of Wandel Mace, which covers the period of time from 1809 to 1890, and this is coming from pages 38 through 39. In the course of his, meaning Joseph Smith's, remarks, he spoke of the earth being divided at various times. He said, when Enoch and his city was taken away, a portion of the earth was taken and would be restored. Also, in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. See Genesis 10, chapter 25, or chapter 10, verse 25. He then referred to the 10 tribes, saying, you know, a long time ago, in the days of Salmanasar, king of Assyria, when the 10 tribes were taken away and never heard of since, he said, the earth will be restored as at its beginning, and the last taken away will be the first to return. For the last shall be first, and the first will be last in all things. He illustrated the return by saying, some of you, brethren, have been coming up the river on a steamboat, and while seated at the table, the steamboat ran against a snag, which upset the table and scattered the dishes. So it will be when these portions of the earth return. It will make the earth reel to and fro like a drunken man. Quoting the 24th chapter of Isaiah, 20th verse. When speaking of the return of the 10 tribes, he said, the mountains of ice shall flow down at their presence, and a highway shall be cast up in the midst of the great deep. So, friends, we've got numerous credible accounts from the leaders of the early church, the church's own publications, and the journals of faithful saints that clearly indicate that there is an incredible black swan type event that will be associated with the restoration of the lost 10 tribes. Now, if the lost 10 tribes are restored in this kind of fashion, you can understand why Jeremiah would have pronounced that their return would rival the Exodus of Egypt. Now, I've referenced this a couple of times, so let's go to Jeremiah and read specifically what it says. Okay, you can read this in Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 14 through 15, and also in chapter 23, verses 7 through 8, and verses 19 through 20. I'm not going to read all of those verses. I'm just going to summarize what these verses say. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord liveth that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but rather, the Lord liveth that brought Israel forth from the north countries. Behold, a whirlwind of the Lord is gone forth in fury, even a grievous whirlwind. It shall fall grievously upon the heads of the wicked. In the latter days ye shall consider it perfectly. Okay, so if you go back to Ezekiel's vision, he describes these wheels that bring the lost tribes of Israel, he describes them as a whirlwind. And Jeremiah is saying here that when this happens, nobody is going to want to talk about what the Lord did in dividing the Red Sea. They're only going to want to talk about what the Lord did when he restored those from the north country. When the scriptures are talking about those from the north country, they're talking about the lost tribes of Israel, specifically from the perspective that we read in Second Esdras, when the Lord led them from Assyria for a year and a half northward to a mysterious land called Arsareth, which they would remain there until the latter days. And this is what Jeremiah seems to be referring to, that when the Lord brings them back, it will be as a grievous whirlwind that shall fall upon the heads of the wicked, and that in the latter days we will consider it perfectly. Now, let's think about this in the context, again, of this star-like object that came to the earth, because, again, from the perspective of my being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, when Joseph Smith teaches something, I take it very, very seriously. And he taught that the stars falling from the heavens are not stars at all, but are the restoration of fragments of the earth that have been removed in times past. So let's look at this in conjunction with Revelation chapter 9. I'm starting with the first verse. And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth. So according to Joseph Smith, he's not seen a star fall from the earth. He's seen the portion of the former fragment of the earth is returning with a host of the lost 10 tribes on it. And then this continues. And to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. So there is somebody on this object that receives the key to the bottomless pit. Well, elsewhere in the book of Revelation, we are told that Jesus Christ holds the key to death and hell. So if this person has the key to the bottomless pit, it means that it is a mission or a responsibility that he has received from the Lord to do these things. And then in verse 2 it says, and he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit as a smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and upon them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And then when the sixth angel blows his trump, this goes from tormenting the men to wiping out 1/3 of all mankind. So you take this and you look at these other things that we have been talking about, and you've got the makings of something absolutely astounding that is pending. Now, I know that this sounds crazy, but again, if this is true, just like the nature of black swan events is that nobody sees these things coming because they are so far out of what is considered to be plausible under normal circumstances, that nobody in their right mind would give it any credence. However, also one of the telltale characteristics of a black swan event is once they do occur, the evidence that is now looked at without the normalcy bias becomes obvious that something like this was always going to happen. So what other scriptures are there out there that suggest that something like this is going to happen? Well, let's look at Isaiah chapter 66, verse 8. Who hath heard such a thing? Who hath seen such things? Okay, with this kind of verbiage, Isaiah is trying to prepare us so that we understand, hey, he's talking about a black swan event. Okay. Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day? Shall a nation be born at once? So what's Isaiah saying here? He's saying, of course, nations in the normal course of existence aren't brought forth in a single day. That simply doesn't happen. But then he goes on to say, for as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. In other words, Isaiah is saying in this passage that a nation will indeed be born in one day. And that will result in the restoration of the lost tribes of Israel in a black swan event that will rival the Exodus of Egypt. Okay, now I'd like to read Isaiah chapter 49. This is a very interesting chapter, and in order to really understand what this chapter is talking about, we need to approach it from the perspective of Revelation chapter 12, wherein you had Israel was spoken of in that chapter as the portion that was given the wings of a great eagle to leave Satan's prison planet, and then the portion of Israel that was left behind that the great dragon made war against. So those two bodies, of course, the last 10 tribes represents the woman that was given the wings of the eagle, and the remnants that were left behind were the two nation states of the Jews and the house of Joseph. So let's look at this from this perspective. So the first 3 verses, the Lord is speaking to the lost tribes of Israel, and this will become apparent as we read. Listen to this, Isaiah 49, verse 1. Now, again, this is, in these first 3 verses, the lost tribes of Israel are speaking as if in the first person. Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people from afar. The Lord hath called me from the womb. From the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name. And he hath made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hath hidden me, and made me a polished shaft. In his quiver he hath hidden me. And he said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Okay, so here we have a body of the house of Israel speaking in the first person, saying that the Lord has hidden them in the shadow of his hand and made them into a weapon, a hidden weapon. You know, by this we are to understand that the lost 10 tribes of Israel have been hidden from the knowledge of the inhabitants of the earth, and that the day will come when the Lord will use them as a weapon against the wicked. So now we move on to verses 4 through 6, and now this is no longer that portion of the house of Israel speaking. Now it is Isaiah speaking as the prophet who has been called to bring Israel to repentance. So now Isaiah is speaking. Then said I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for naught and in vain. Yet surely my judgment is with the Lord, and my work is with my God. And now saith the Lord, that formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob again to him. Though Israel be not gathered, yet shall I be glorious in the eyes of the Lord, and my God shall be my strength. And he said, Is it a light thing that thou shouldst be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved of Israel? I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be my salvation unto the ends of the earth. So here Isaiah is kind of lamenting the fact that he and his mission have failed in keeping the northern kingdom of Israel from going into apostasy and then from being destroyed by the Assyrians in the first place. And the Lord tells him, hey, listen, Isaiah, it's not your fault that the northern kingdom of Israel didn't listen to me, and so they were destroyed and carried off captives. the day will come when they will be destroyed. And then he says, Isaiah, I haven't only called you to help me preserve Israel, but I've also called you to be a light unto the Gentiles, meaning if the Gentiles will study your words, then they will be prepared for when these things happen, and they will rise up and call you blessed, Isaiah, because of the things that you will have done to prepare them for the things that will take place when the Lord brings back the lost tribes of Israel. Now we move to the two nation states that remain upon the earth. The vision is now should be understood from the perspective of these two nation states, the Jews and the house of Joseph. Thus saith the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, and his Holy One, to whom man despised, to him whom the nations abhorreth, a servant of rulers. Kings shall see and arise, princes shall also worship, because of the Lord that is faithful, and the Holy One of Israel, and he shall choose thee. Thus saith the Lord, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation I have helped thee, and I will preserve thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages. So what's going on here is the house of Israel that remained on the earth, particularly the Jews, was hated. I mean, they were hunted and persecuted. You have only to look at the history of the Jews to know that it was certainly true. But the Lord is saying to the house of Israel, listen, the day is going to come when all the world will know that you are my chosen people, and that I have preserved thee to be a covenant for establishing the earth. And you, meaning Israel, will inherit the desolate heritages, meaning the wicked will be swept from the earth, and the earth will be inherited by Israel. Now continuing in verse 9. That thou mayest say to the prisoners, go forth, and to them that are in darkness, show yourselves. They shall feed in the ways, and their pasture shall be all in high places. They shall not hunger nor thirst, neither shall the heat of the sun smite them. For he that hath mercy on them shall lead them, even by the springs of water shall he guide them. He's referring to the miraculous gathering of Israel that will result in them coming to inherit the desolate heritages. Then in verse 11, and I will make all my mountains a way, and my highways shall be exalted. Meaning, hey, when these guys come, the places that are the hardest for you to get to, the mountains, they will be an easy path for these folks to come. Because think back to the wheels within a wheel and the wings and the eyes that the house of Israel was covered with, representing extraordinary intelligence and also the ability to move in ways that we cannot. That is what makes all the mountains a way, and the exalting of all of the highways. Now continuing in verse 12, behold, these shall come from far, and lo, these from the north and from the west, and these from the land of Sinim. Sing, O ye heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and break forth into singing, O mountains, for the Lord will have mercy upon his afflicted. Meaning the Jews who will have been sieged by the Antichrist and the beast and all of the armies of the earth that joined forces with them will have been sieging Jerusalem and the Jews for 3.5 years, and they will be at the point of collapsing. But the Lord is saying, listen, I am going to have mercy on them, and that mercy in large part is going to come from him remembering the covenants that he had made with Abraham and with their forefathers. But the Jews at this time of their great affliction don't see it this way. All they see is that they're getting their heads handed to them. And this is the perspective that we see in verse 14. But Zion said, the Lord hath forsaken me, and my Lord hath forgotten me. Can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion upon the son of her womb? Yea, they may forget, yet I will not forget thee. Behold, I have graven thee upon the palms of my hands. Thy walls are continually before me. Thy children shall make haste. Thy destroyers and they that made thee waste shall go forth of thee. Lift up thine eyes round about, and behold, all these gather themselves together and come unto thee. Meaning, listen, look at this massive multitude of Israel that has come together. And in order for you to see them, you have to lift up your eyes and look round about. Meaning, they're not coming under normal conditions. You got to look heavenward, and then you see them come. As I live, saith the Lord, thou shalt surely clothe thee with them all, as with an ornament, and bind them on thee, as a bride doeth. Meaning, these will be your inheritance, and they're your family members. This is going to be a glorious event when all the house of Israel is restored, and you will rejoice just like you rejoice at a wedding. Now in verse 19, for thy waste and thy desolate places and the land of thy destruction shall even now be too narrow by reason of the inhabitants, and they that swallowed thee shall be far away. Meaning, this massive host that you are looking up into the heavens to see coming to you, they will come into the ancestral lands that were given to their forefathers, and it will be too narrow for them. There will be so many inhabitants coming back with them, and literally nations being born in a single day, that there's not enough space there. That's what that is saying. Now, picking back up in verse 20, the children which thou shalt have after thou hast lost the others shall say in thine ears, the place is too strait for me. Give me place that I may dwell. Meaning, listen, we are so many, we're as innumerable as the sands of the sea. We need more space. There's simply not enough space in the lands of Israel. We are going to have to start occupying the desolate heritages of the Gentiles, is essentially what that's saying. And now in verse 21, then shalt thou say in thy heart, this is the Jews and Joseph that remained here on Satan's prison planet, who hath begotten me these, seeing I have lost my children, and am desolate, a captive, and removing to and fro? Who hath brought up these? Behold, I was left alone. These, where had they been? So here you have Isaiah explaining again in the kind of imagery that only he can use, that a massive host of Israel is going to come back and be rejoined with both the Jews and Joseph. And when that happens, both Judah and Joseph will be astounded by the sheer numbers of the house of Israel. And it will be an absolutely glorious reunion. This is what Isaiah chapter 49 is talking about. This is the return of the kings of the east that is spoken of in the book of Revelation, when the river Euphrates is dried up to prepare the way for their return. So we're talking about incredible black swan events that are going to be so incredible as to boggle the mind and just radically change the way things are seen and talked about. This is why after this kind of stuff happens, the world never even wants to talk about the God that divided the Red Sea so that the house of Israel could walk through. They only want to talk about the God that restored the 10 tribes. So let's look at some additional examples of this. Now, again, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have other scriptures. I mentioned the Book of Mormon is what we consider to be the testament of the house of Joseph in America. But we also have a book that's referred to as the Doctrine and Covenants. And the Doctrine and Covenants includes a record of revelations that Joseph Smith received on behalf of the church. And there is a very interesting passage from one of those, and I'm going to read this. This comes from Doctrine and Covenants, section 112, verses 23 through 26. Verily, verily, I say unto you, darkness covereth the earth, and gross darkness the minds of the people. And all flesh has become corrupt before my face. Behold, vengeance cometh speedily upon the inhabitants of the earth, a day of wrath, a day of burning, a day of desolation, of weeping, of mourning, and of lamentation. And as a whirlwind it shall come upon the face of the earth. And upon my house shall it begin, and from my house shall it go forth, saith the Lord. First among those among you, saith the Lord, who have professed to know my name, and have not known me, and have blasphemed against me in the midst of my house. So in this revelation, this seems very reminiscent of what we have read or talked about in the prior episode from the first 12 chapters of Ezekiel, when the Lord brought down the wrath of God upon Jerusalem because of the blasphemy of his people that had crucified his only begotten Son and had filled Jerusalem with works of darkness and the evil conspiring of the Jewish leaders who were actively persecuting the Christians and driving them out. And so the Lord brought down he rained down destruction on Jerusalem. And according to Doctrine and Covenants section 112, something very similar will happen in the last days, and it again seems to be represented as a whirlwind that comes upon the face of the earth and purges it. Now, I believe that whirlwind is associated with the restoration of the lost tribes of Israel. So let's look at some additional passages. So I mentioned that in the last episode that the Book of Mormon came about when Moroni, who was the last prophet of the Book of Mormon, hid the records and then appeared to Joseph Smith as an angel and told him where he could find those records. Now, Moroni appeared to Joseph Smith 5 times in a 24-hour period of time and gave him the exact same message. And in that message, he quotes lots of different scriptures over and over. And all of the scriptures that are quoted all have to do with the restoration of Israel in the last days. And some of them he quoted differently from how they read in the Bible. Now, this is one of those, an example of this. This is a passage from Malachi, but Moroni quotes it differently from how it reads in Malachi. So I will read this verse and then I'll tell you what's different. For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, all that do wickedly, shall burn as stubble. For they that come shall burn them, saith the Lord of hosts, and it shall leave them neither root nor branch. Now, I don't know if you caught that, but I highlighted, for they that come shall burn them. Moroni added this to this verse, meaning he wanted to highlight the fact that someone was coming that was going to facilitate the burning of the wicked. Now, again, in the book of Revelation, when you have these stars that come to the earth, it's associated with 1/3 of the earth being burnt. So I believe, again, Joseph Smith taught that these aren't stars at all. They're former fragments of the earth that are being restored. So this is, some very curious information. Now, here's another passage. This comes from the Doctrine and Covenants, section 133, that talks about this as well. Listen to this. For he, meaning God, shall make bare his holy arm in the eyes of all nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of their God. Wherefore prepare ye, O my people, sanctify yourselves. For when they who are in the north countries shall come in remembrance before the Lord, and their prophets shall hear his voice, and shall no longer stay themselves, and shall smite the rocks, and the ice shall flow down at their presence, and a highway shall be cast up in the midst of the great deep. Their enemies shall become a prey unto them, and they shall bring forth their rich treasures unto the children of Ephraim, my servants, and the boundaries of the everlasting hills shall tremble at their presence. This is Doctrine and Covenants, section 133, verses 1 and 26 through 31. So in this passage, you have the restoration of the lost tribes of Israel returning in a miraculous manner, wherein the ice flows down at their presence. Now, from prior teachings from Joseph Smith that we went over earlier, Joseph Smith is literally saying, hey, when the portion of the earth is restored, it's going to blow ice all over the place. You have passages in the book of Revelation that talk about this time period, and they say that there will be, when there's this massive earthquake, there will also be a great hail, wherein the weight of the hailstones, everyone will be about the weight of a talent, which a talent is over 70 pounds. So think about a 70-pound chunk of ice falling from the sky. It says that the inhabitants of the earth curse God because of the terrible, this terrible hailstorm. Now, there is no way that you can have hailstones from normal thunderclouds that are over 70 pounds each raining down. This has to be something supernatural that is causing this. And, if you are a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and you believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet, when he is talking about this restoration of the 10 tribes coming and driving the ice back from the north, and the earth shaking as a drunken man when this happens, the fact that 75-pound chunks of ice start raining down on the earth makes a heck of a lot more sense than just a normal hailstorm. Now, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints understand this peculiar reference to the 10 tribes returning to the children of Ephraim in the shadow of the everlasting hills as being a reference to the fact that the lost tribes of Israel are first going to return to North America, because North America is the nation state of Joseph. Now, when you look in the book of Genesis in chapter 49, when Jacob is old and he's about to die, he places his hands on all of his 12 sons and gives them a blessing. And when he places his hands on Joseph's head, he blesses Joseph that he will be as a fruitful vine that grows up and over the wall, and that his enemies will hate him and shoot their arrows at him, but that the Lord would strengthen Joseph and preserve him, he who was separated from his brethren, which means that Joseph would be separated from the ancestral lands of inheritance that were given to Abraham. In other words, America would be given to Joseph. Now, if you look at the founding of America, particularly when our first president was sworn in, which was George Washington did not want to be sworn in unless he could place his hand on a Bible. Now, this took place in Federal Hall, and at the time there were no Bibles in the hall. No one had thought to bring one. So somebody went out and grabbed a Bible and brought it in. And This Bible is still on display. You can check it out. But incredibly, I don't think it's any coincidence at all. They have the Bible open to the page that George Washington laid his hand upon. And wouldn't you know it, he lays his hand upon this promise that Jacob gave to Joseph, that he would be a fruitful vine that would grow up and over the wall, and that he would be preserved from the arrows of his enemies, and that he would be separated from his brethren. I think that this is another indication that America isn't just any country, that its inhabitants have the blood of Israel in their veins, particularly that of Joseph. And that these things will become abundantly more clear to us in the last days. So, again, in this passage, it says that when the 10 tribes return and they come to the children of Ephraim and they wipe out the children of Ephraim's enemies, they will be so great that the boundaries of the everlasting hills will tremble at their presence. Now, the Bible talks about the everlasting hills being the inheritance of Joseph. So again, this is referring to the 10 tribes or coming back to the promised lands of Joseph and are freeing them from their captivity that they will be under. Now, I mentioned that Jesus Christ came and ministered to the inhabitants of America, and that his ministrations are recorded in the Book of Mormon. Well, and that you can read about that in 3rd Nephi. Well, he gave an incredible discourse in 3rd Nephi about what is going to happen in America in the last days when the 10 tribes return. And, he talks about this in chapters 15, 16, 20, 21, and 22. And I'm not going to read all of those. So I've just taken some excerpts from those chapters that paint a picture of what's going to happen. Here's what they said. Here's what it says. And thus commandeth the Father that I should say unto you, at the day when the Gentiles shall sin against my gospel and shall reject the fullness of my gospel, I will suffer my people, meaning the lost 10 tribes, that they shall go amongst them, and they shall tread them down. And they shall be as the salt that has lost its savor, which is thenceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and to be trodden under the foot of my people. And I will execute vengeance and fury upon them, even as upon the heads of the heathen, such as they have not heard. Yea, woe be unto the Gentiles, except they repent. For it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Father, that I will cut off thy horses out of the midst of thee, and I will destroy thy chariots, and I will cut off thy cities of thy land, and throw down all thy strongholds. For Israel shall break forth on the right hand and on the left, and Israel's seed shall inherit the Gentiles, and make the cities, the desolate cities, to be inhabited. So here Christ is clearly indicating to the house of Joseph that in the last days, if the inhabitants of America do not get their acts together, and if they turn their backs upon the gospel of Jesus Christ and listen to the Antichrist and the general lies and deceptions that will be going on, that they will be swept off the continent by this returning host of Israel that will have power to wipe them out. And there's that many of those verses that Christ was talking about in 3rd Nephi are actually pulled from the Old Testament, from Micah and from Isaiah and from Malachi and other places. So he's just quoting some of these Old Testament prophets and saying these things are going to be fulfilled upon the North American continent. Now, you have other Old Testament prophets, such as Joel, that also talked about this same event. Now, I mentioned that when Moroni came and talked to Joseph Smith and told him where he could find the ancient record of Joseph, he also quoted from Joel. And I'm going to read some particular passages from Joel chapter 2. Listen to this. This is talking about this same time period when the lost 10 tribes are restored and what they do to the wicked. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sanctify a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the people, sanctify the congregation. Let the priests, the ministers of the Lord, weep between the porch and the altar, and let them say, spare thy people. And the Lord shall utter his voice before his army. Now, remember, in Ezekiel chapter 37, he saw this massive army rise from the dry bones. And the Lord told him that this represented the house of Israel. This army, the Lord has raised up, will come forth from the lost tribes of Israel. This is the army that Joel is talking about. Now we continue. For his camp is very great, for he is strong that executeth his word. For the day of the Lord is great and very terrible, and who can abide it? A fire devoureth before the Lord's army, and behind them a flame burneth. The land is as the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them a desolate wilderness. Yea, and nothing shall escape them. Like the noise of chariots on the tops of mountains shall they leap, like the noise of a flame of fire that devoureth the stubble, as a strong people set in battle array. Before their face the people shall be much pained, and all faces shall gather blackness. So Joel is talking about the great and terrible day of the Lord shall be centered around this massive army of the Lord that will return and wipe out the wicked in a black swan event that nobody sees coming. Now, let's look at Isaiah chapter 13, because Isaiah talks about this same thing, and it's really interesting what he says. I'm going to pull some passages out of Isaiah chapter 13. Listen to this. The Lord of hosts mustereth the hosts of the battle. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven. Okay, so Isaiah is saying that this army that's going to come and wipe out the wicked is coming from the ends of heaven. Yea, the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand, and it shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all hands be faint, every man's heart shall melt, and they shall be afraid. Pangs and sorrow shall take hold of them. They shall be amazed at one another. Their faces shall be as flames. Meaning, when the 10 tribes return, they're going to burn the wicked, and the wicked will be shocked. Now, another passage that I want to share with you, this comes from the writings of Mormon. Now, Mormon was, we call the Book of Mormon the Book of Mormon because Mormon was an ancient historian. He was also a general that fought in the final battles of this nation state of Joseph that existed in the Americas. And there were many records, and he compiled the Book of Mormon from, these records. So it's not a comprehensive account of this nation state. It's just the particular things that the Lord told Mormon that he needed to include to help us prepare for the events that are going to happen in the last days. Now, Mormon sees this entire nation state collapse, and he's, he records this in Mormon chapter 6. Now, his final words before he tells us about the collapse of his people and their utter destruction is he gives us a warning because he sees that this is going to happen to us. And this is what he says in his warning, which can be read in more in the last verses of Mormon chapter 5. Therefore, Gentiles, repent ye, and humble yourselves before him, lest he shall come out in justice against you, lest a remnant of the seed of Jacob shall go forth among you as a lion and tear you in pieces, and there is none to deliver. This remnant of Jacob that he is talking about is the lost tribes of Israel that the Lord will preserve. He's saying that they will come amongst you and tear you apart if you are not turning to the Lord and striving to keep his commandments. This is essentially the same thing that John the Revelator was saying is, hey, listen, these guys are going to wipe out anyone who does not have the seal of God in their foreheads, just like happened to the Jews in Jerusalem in Ezekiel's prophecies. So we have seen several different accounts that are talking about these things that are, very curious, that seem to indicate that the Lord has some very interesting things in mind for the last days. Now, I know that some of you are probably saying this sounds absolutely crazy, that the Lord would do anything like this. Well, again, think about Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 4. This is Moses talking to Israel before they enter into their lands of promise. And he's warning them because, listen, the Lord's already shown me you guys are going to be idiots and you're not going to keep the commandments. And so you're going to be scattered to the winds. And he said this, if any of thine be driven out to the utmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. Well, this is exactly what all of these other passages have been talking about, that the Lord has literally taken remnants of the house of Israel and planted them in the heavens and will restore them to the earth in the last days. And in fact, there's a passage in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 16, that says exactly this. Now, Isaiah is, if you read the chapter in its context, it is explicitly talking about the northern kingdom of Israel, which was destroyed and carried off captive in Isaiah's day. In fact, Isaiah named his two children as signs of Israel. One of his sons was named a remnant shall return, meaning a remnant of the northern kingdom of Israel shall return in the last days. And that remnant is the remnant that we're talking about. Now, in Isaiah 16, he goes on to say this, I have put my words in thy mouth, meaning this branch of Israel that has been taken by the Lord has their own book of Revelations, and when they return, they're going to be able to bring that back, and we will have another record of the Lord's dealings with this remnant of Israel that has apparently been removed from the earth. And that seems to be what Isaiah is saying next. It continues, and I have covered thee in the shadow of my hand, meaning that he has hid this portion of Israel from the rest of the earth. We don't have any knowledge of them. That I may plant the heavens. So the Lord is saying, I hid these from you, and I planted them in the heavens. Then he says, and lay the foundations of the earth, and say unto Zion, thou art my people. In other words, he's saying, when this group is brought back from the outermost parts of heaven, then all the inhabitants of the earth will know without a shadow of a doubt that I have remembered my covenants and my people. And everyone will no longer look at Israel and scratch their heads and be wagging their tongues at them and condemning them, but instead they'll realize this is Zion. This is the Lord's people. Now, one other passage, and this is, I'm going to conclude this episode with this. In the Book of Mormon, you have probably one of the most quintessential discourses on the house of Israel in the scriptures is found in Jacob chapter 5. It's the longest chapter of the Book of Mormon, and it talks about the scattering and gathering of Israel in the form of an allegory. It's called the allegory of the olive vineyard. And the vineyard represents the earth, and the trees of the vineyard represent the house of Israel. And there is the main tree of Israel that was the original house of Israel. And then due to its corruption, it is broken off in three separate events: the first, the second, and the third. The first grafting event corresponds with the destruction of the first nation state of Israel. The second grafting event corresponds with the destruction of the second nation state of Israel, which would have been the Jews. And the third grafting event corresponds with the destruction of the third nation state of Israel, which would be the nation state of Joseph in America. So what this passage says about the first grafting, given that the first grafting corresponds with the northern kingdom of Israel, which was the first nation state to be destroyed, what it has to say about that nation state's graftings is very interesting. Listen to this. How comest thou hither to plant this tree, or this branch of the tree? For behold, it was the poorest spot in all the land of thy vineyard. So a portion of this first grafting was grafted into the worst place in the vineyard, which means it was taken to the worst place on the planet, and it was grafted there. And the master of the vineyard says to his servant, Look hither, behold, I have planted another branch of the tree also, and thou knowest that this spot of ground was poorer than the first. So the servant says, this first grafting was worse than any place in the entire world. And then the master of the vineyard goes, well, you think that's bad? Look at this other portion of Israel that I've taken to some place worse than anywhere else on earth. Meaning, the only way that that could be possible is if it wasn't on earth at all. And that seems to be consistent with everything that we have been talking about here in this episode. Okay, so let's review what we've talked about here. I've gone over numerous different scriptures that refer to an incredible group of Israel that is going to come back to the earth in a black swan style event that will fulfill the prophecies in Isaiah that talk about a nation being born at once. Their return will result in the destruction of the wicked. It is going to rival the exodus of Egypt. It is going to result in 1/3 of mankind being killed, burned, as it were. And it's going to result in the liberation of the righteous. Okay, so let's review what we have talked about in this episode. We started out with a prophecy from the Apocrypha that spoke of a body of the house of Israel that once they were in Assyria, they said, listen, guys, our fathers were doofuses. We have been doofuses. We have not kept the covenants of the Lord as we should have. Therefore, let's repent. Let's turn to the Lord, and let's see if he can take us to another land. And that's exactly what happened. The Lord led them forth to a new land called Arsareth, where they were to reside until the latter days. And that the sign of their return would be the drying up of the Euphrates River. And when they return, they would come back as the kings of the East, meaning kings are kings of nations. So they would come back in massive numbers that could constitute multiple nations. And we reviewed how Jeremiah taught that this would, rival the Exodus of Egypt in the spectacle and wonder of it all. And Isaiah, we reviewed several different prophecies of Isaiah, wherein Isaiah hints to the fact that nations will indeed be born in a single day, and that when that happens, both Judah and Joseph will be astounded by the fact, and that the restoration of the house of Israel in such massive numbers will necessitate the occupying of the Gentile, cities and inheritances, because they have been swept off by this time, and because they forsook the Lord and the covenants, and the Lord wiped them out to make way for a people that would make and keep covenants with the God of Israel, because God is a covenant keeping and making God. So, friends, I hope that from this episode, you are taking away the fact that, wow, there is a lot more to the restoration of the house of Israel than maybe you have thought about in the past, that Israel is not irrelevant. They could not be more relevant to the events of the last day. We are about to see some of the most incredible miracles that have ever transpired in the history of this planet. And when we see these things happen, it's just going to blow our socks off. We are simply not going to believe it. And it's going to be the only thing we're ever going to want to talk about going forward, because it is going to be so incredibly awesome. Well, friends, that's enough for this episode. In prior episodes, we're going to talk about the timing of these things and how these things are all fitting and reconciling together. There's much, much more for us to discuss. And I hope that you're not looking at this podcast as a destination for your studies, but more as a launch pad for your studies, a springboard, because you really need to be going, seeking knowledge from the Lord, asking for his guidance as you consider all of these peculiar things. Pray that the Lord will be able to open your eyes, that you can have eyes to see and a heart to feel, that you can accept the truth regardless of whatever your predetermined biases have been. At the end of the day, it's not about tradition or culture or anything else. It's about truth, and we should seek for truth wherever it is. And just as Jesus Christ said so many times, they that seek shall find. All right, that's enough for today. Until next time, friends, God bless.
You have just finished an episode of the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production, hosted by Michael B. Rush. For show notes, transcriptions, and extras, please visit www.theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, click the share button icon and send it to your friends and family. This will help to ensure the continued publication of future content. Michael thanks you in advance for sharing and looks forward to seeing you next time. Until then, keep seeking, for they that seek shall find.